Most of us dream of sailing happily off into the sunset, but many of us also wonder, how much money will I need to actually do it? In other words, how much is enough to retire? And you know, there's no one-size-fits-all answer, but there is a way to determine the answer that's right for you. It's time once again to tune out the hype and focus on the facts, facts that matter to you, the income generation. Let's get started. Get ready to separate reality from myth.
With us, David Scranton.
David Scranton.
David Scranton.
David Scranton.
But David Scranton says, hey, not so fast.
How does it affect the markets? How does it affect the economy? Thanks to efficiencies in new technology and a staff of veteran analysts and portfolio managers, Sound Income Strategies strives to set new standards and bring institutional-style investing to your portfolio. Hello, I'm David Scranton. Have you ever gone to a baseball game or taken a trip without first taking some time to figure out how much it's going to cost? Probably not. None of us would want to take that risk showing up somewhere looking forward to enjoying ourselves, only to realize we didn't bring enough money with us. Naturally, we all want to enjoy retirement, so it's important to approach it in the same way, by taking some time to figure out exactly how much it's going to cost. And there's a right way to do it and a wrong way to do it, and today we're going to show you the right way. Helping us out today will be our guests, John Grace and Tommy Brown. But first, let's compare a couple of different approaches to calculating your retirement costs. When figuring out how much you'll need for retirement, how should you approach the calculation? From the bottom up or from the top down? And what's the difference? Well, in calculating from the bottom up, you simply add up all your anticipated expenses that you think you might have during retirement. Now, admittedly, this seems like perhaps the most logical approach, and it's the way that many people attempt to do it. It's how you'd approach it, for example, going to that baseball game. You'd figure out how much will the tickets cost, how much is the parking, hot dogs, so on and so forth. And this approach is perfectly fine for a ball game or even for a vacation. Unfortunately, it's not the best approach for retirement. And the main reason is simply this. Inevitably, you will miss things. You will almost certainly overlook items and undercalculate things in trying to determine 30 years of retirement expenses. We'll talk a lot more about that a little bit later. The fact is, a much better approach to determining how much you'll need for retirement is to do what I call a top-down financial analysis. You see, with a top-down analysis, instead of adding up your expected retirement expenses, instead you start by identifying the expenses and contributions that you expect to go away during retirement. Then you subtract those from your current gross income. For example, if you're making $100,000 a year while working, you can figure out how much of that is going into your 401k and subtract that from the $100,000. You can also subtract the FICA tax that comes out of your paycheck. Why? Because you don't have to pay FICA tax on retirement income. And if you expect to have your mortgage paid off by the time you retire, you can subtract that monthly expense as well. But for every subtraction that you make, you also need to determine whether it's pre-tax or post-tax. And your mortgage is a really good example because it's a mixed bag. Every payment is a mix of principal and interest. At the beginning, it's more interest and less principal. And at the end, it becomes more principal, less interest. So in terms of your top-down analysis, the interest portion of the payment can come right off the top of your income, off your gross income, because it's tax deductible. However, the principal portion needs to be grossed up. Why? Because it's after tax. It's not deductible. So what are some other examples of post-tax expenses? Well, there's that FICA deduction from your paycheck. That is paid with after-tax dollars, and therefore, it has to be grossed up. The same goes for car payments that you think you may not carry into retirement, as well as any amounts that you're adding annually to a bank, a credit union, or a savings account. All those expenses have to be grossed up for taxes. So let's just say hypothetically that when you gross up all of those, you end up with $30,000 of expenses that will not be carried into retirement. Subtract that from 100, and you get $70,000 a year of pre-tax income that you're really spending now. So does that mean that $70,000 a year is the answer to the question, how much do I need to retire? Well, not exactly. Why? Because doing a top-down financial analysis is only the first step to determining how much you need to retire. It doesn't end there. There are several additional steps, starting with goal setting. If you really want a chance of accurately answering the question, how much do I need to retire, Identifying your specific retirement goals is a key part of the process. And the good news is that most people don't have elaborate or unusually expensive retirement goals. They're not interested in buying a yacht or sailing around the world or moving into a Manhattan penthouse. So for most people, their goals involve things like being able to dine out more, travel more, pursuing their favorite pastimes, and spending time with their grandchildren, all while enjoying the same basic lifestyle and level of wealth. In other words, most people don't have goals that involve major purchases like that or extremely extravagant expenses. Instead, they have goals that they're probably going to be able to achieve through a reasonable income stream, not dramatically different from what they're already accustomed to. But even if your goals aren't elaborate, it's still important to take the time to identify them and to estimate their costs. Let's say you want to travel, for example. Well, where to and how often? And are your grandchildren close by? Or will you have to get on a plane every time you visit them? If you're a golfer, how much your annual club fee is going to run? So once you have a rough idea of how much it's going to cost to pursue your goals each year, you can add it to your anticipated general expenses, the work we've done so far, and measure it alongside that work. That's called top-down analysis. And for the purpose of this exercise, we're including healthcare as part of your general living expenses, although we'll talk about that more. The topic of healthcare is a separate issue a bit later in the show. So with that in mind, will that $70,000 be sufficient? And if so, how much of it will you need to come from savings and investments? Now, to make that determination, you first have to identify and calculate your other sources of retirement income. And we'll talk more about that in just a few minutes. Now it's time to welcome our first guest, John Grace, President of Investors Advantage Corp. In Westlake Village, California. He possesses more than 30 years of experience in the securities industry. Mr. Grace is a registered principal with Securities America Financial Corp. And a contributing columnist for the Wave newspapers. John, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Dave. Good to be here.
You know, you write a lot of great articles for the Wave newspaper and also on social media. You've written an article, actually a number of articles on baby boomers, or about what we like to call the income generation. So
Sure.
Tell me about your recent article about baby boomers getting a 26% score on the American College's New York Life Center for Retirement Income 2017 survey. I think that score would come as a surprise to almost everybody watching the show today.
Well, that's why I had to write that, Dave, because it surprised me, and I think it would come to a surprise to so many of us. And part of what I found so fascinating is another source that shows that we're in our 60s, our confidence level stays high between the 70s and the 80s% well through our 80s in terms of age. But when it comes to literacy, we start age 60 north of 60%, and by age 80, we're dropping off to 30 and 25 and 20% by 25, by age 85. So, well, of course, what that means is that we all think we're doing just fine, and it's kind of unconscious where the brain isn't functioning as well as it used to, and we're not getting the kind of attention that we deserve because we can't cry out for help. So, you know, we're kind of working against ourselves, and it's really in the dark.
Well, it's like, you know, if I go on a basketball court, you know, I oftentimes think I could still do the same stuff that I could do on a basketball court I could do when I was a teenager, but obviously it doesn't quite work that way. But, you know,
well, you can in your mind, but don't play with any teenagers, right? Because they will take your butt off the court.
That's right. They'll prove you wrong for sure. But, you know, the funny thing here is, you know, baby boomers also are, you know, in their 50s. So is there any differentiation in that test between those that are in their 50s from maybe those that are now getting into their 70s?
I didn't see one. The work started at age 60, and unfortunately, I didn't see any data before age 60. So I think that's a very good question. So I can't compare or see a relationship between how much better we were maybe in our 50s and how it's working past age 60. But I mean, let's recognize that this year, 2018, we have Donald John Wayne Trump, Janet Yellen, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, all turning 72, 2018. Born 1946, of course, and Michelle Obama breaks up the rear, for example, born 1964. So I think that makes her, 54 this year. So, you know, we've got 76 million people who are wanting to believe that everything is just fine. And as I said to a group of clients, look, if you don't bring your children in the equation, I think it's appropriate that you bring an advocate to the table. In other words,
Yeah,
someone who knows you, knows what you're
of
trying to
course.
do, can be the person who helps you second guess what you're doing, as opposed to just believing blindly that everything's just fine and I can just continue to coast.
So John, so what do you think are some of the major areas where people got the lowest score, or in your experience, the areas where you think people need the most help, they need the most education?
Well, the first area that certainly got my attention was about the confidence. I mean, isn't that fascinating that we are overconfident? You know, we
Yeah.
still think we can play ball the way we used to be able to play it. So I think it calls for us to have a better assessment of what we're trying to accomplish. Let me give you, I think, a very good example. Many people would believe, certainly if they've been through two 50% losses, 00 to 02, 08, 09, we can weather that storm. But we haven't done the math, okay? In other words, maybe that worked for you when you were contributing, but that was then. And now you're either at or near a position, or already in a position
Hmm.
where you're taking withdrawals. So can you withstand a 20, 40, 50% loss as
Right.
you're taking withdrawals? Probably not. But we don't do the math, or have someone help us do the math,
Mm.
so that we can get out of our mind and say, well, that worked fine, but those were different conditions. I was making contributions, and that was a practice that was more
Yeah.
friendly, making contributions when markets are declining.
But
That
how do you
practice may become your foe.
how do you teach that, though? I've seen studies that investors, do-it-yourself investors in general, tend to have too much confidence. And as you may know, I'm a pilot, and when
Yes.
you learn how to fly an airplane, the FAA teaches you, how to get over some of those things, whether you have a characteristic of being macho or impulsive or the feeling of invulnerability. So in the 30 seconds or so we have left in this segment, the question becomes, how can we teach that to people and bring that sort of self-analysis and humility back?
Well, to continue being a pilot, you have to be tested, correct? So it would be appropriate for us to test our assumptions, to run the analysis, to look at, let's say, just go back to 08, 09, and suppose you were taking withdrawals instead of making contributions, or suppose you weren't having to take required minimum distributions as you are past 70 and a half, as you know. So let's run the numbers so that you can see, is the evidence there that I could weather, or let me ask another way. What loss could you accept to see that your account is effectively unaffected by those losses, as opposed to just believing buy and hold always works?
And of course, you have to ask people to manage themselves, which is the hardest thing. But hey, who knows? You live in California, so you never know. If any state's willing to pass a law that says you need to have a license to do your own investments, California might just be that. Hey, stick with us, please. We'll be right back in just a minute. And you, too, stay with us for a lot more from John Grace. If you're near or in retirement, head over to theincomegeneration.com and download your special report written specifically for the needs of the income generation. Again, those born before 1966. I'm David Scranton, and you've been watching The Income Generation. So far, you've done your top-down analysis and identified your goals. And that should give you a good idea of the amount of annual income you'll need for retirement. But before you figure out how much is going to have to come from savings and investments, you'll need to identify the retirement income that you can already count on. Obviously, one of the most significant of these for most people will be Social Security. And as with any income source, you'll want to take the appropriate steps to get the most you possibly can out of Social Security. There are several strategies you can use to maximize these benefits and reduce your tax burden. And a qualified financial advisor familiar with Social Security can help you with those. But if you want to start by getting a basic idea of what your benefits will be, you can do that also. As you may know, when your benefit is calculated, it'll be based primarily on two things. First, the age at which you apply for benefits. And second, how much you've earned over the course of your working career. Based upon those two factors, you can do some calculating on your own and determine roughly how much you can expect to get using the following resources. Visit and use the Secure Retirement Estimator, which gives you your earnings history after you enter some personal data. Or you can use one of the three calculators at the web address on the screen. Once you've estimated your Social Security benefits, next is time to identify any other known sources of retirement income. A pension is a good example here. Or if you intend to continue working as a consultant for a period after leaving your job, that's another very good example. Or obviously, if you plan to get another part-time job, whatever the income source, add it to your estimated Social Security benefits and then measure that against whatever number you came up with after doing your top-down financial analysis and calculating the cost of your goals. So for simplicity's sake, let's say your top-down analysis, again, did in fact reveal that you could continue living the same lifestyle on that $70,000 I mentioned a moment ago, instead of the $100,000 after retirement, thanks to all the expenses that went away. But after calculating the cost of your goals, the estimate came back up to $80,000. Then when you added up your estimated income from Social Security and your pension, let's say it totaled $40,000. Well, now you know that you need your assets to provide an additional $40,000 annually to have the kind of retirement that you desire. So at a basic level, you've now answered the question, how much do I need to retire? And this is just one example, of course. Depending upon your goals and the results of your top-down analysis, you could need considerably less than $40,000 annually from your investments. Or in some cases, you might possibly need more. Either way, the next question you need to answer is this. How much money will I need in a lump sum at retirement to generate that $40,000 a year? Now that is a trickier question. Why? Because there's a lot of variables of unknown type that exist here. And the primary variables are twofold. And believe it or not, they're connected. Number one, how much you need depends upon how you invest your money. And number two, taking into account those investment strategies, it may also depend upon your longevity. I'll explain that a lot more in just a moment. But the point is that while identifying a lump sum is important, it's equally important to have an asset allocation that helps ensure the lump sum won't be depleted before your death. So let's talk more about that. You may have heard of a financial rule of thumb known as the 4% rule. It proposes that for average investors, the most they would be able to draw from their retirement accounts each year without running out of money would be 4% per year. Now, what you may not know is that recent study by Morningstar concluded that in today's environment of low interest rates and overvalued stocks, the safe withdrawal rate for average investors now stands at just about 2.8% per year. As with similar studies, this one is based upon something known as Monte Carlo analysis, which seeks to identify a figure that gives you a percent chance of success. In this case, a 90% chance of success. And in this case, success simply means not running out of money. So even at 2.8%, the study concludes that there's still a 10% chance of depleting your assets and running out of money. Why? Because if you're withdrawing money from your accounts to meet your income needs, even at just 2.8% per year, you're depending on the markets to grow and to replace your withdrawals. But as we all know, the markets fluctuate, sometimes dramatically. And after the age of 50 or so, you start to lose the luxury of time being on your side to recoup big losses. That's why, as I've stressed many times on the show, taking income from principal, taking cash flow from principal within 10 or 15 years of retirement is a slippery slope. For example, if you're selling shares from a mutual fund every year to meet your income needs, you're engaging in a backward strategy, cost reverse, dollar cost averaging. Basically, you end up cannibalizing your account because you have to sell more shares to get the same amount whenever the market drops. And this is where your longevity becomes a variable when determining what the lump sum is that you need. Cannibalizing your assets may not matter if you only live 10 years after retirement, but if you live longer, the question of your running out of money becomes a race against time. Your longevity is much less a factor if your income isn't coming from principal, and instead coming from interest or dividends, as we'll see in a moment. But what's more, simple math dictates that at 2.8% a year, you would need a lump sum of about $1.5 million to meet your $40,000 per year needs. Whereas a strategy closer to the old 4% rule would only require $1 million in a lump sum. In the end, the question of how much money will I need in a lump sum to meet my income needs is only part of the equation. The more important question is what asset allocation gives me the best chance of meeting my income needs without the risk of depleting my assets. And that answer lies in having the right focus and not falling prey to outdated ideas or misconceptions. And again, we'll talk about that also coming up just a bit on the show. Right now, it's time to welcome back John Grace from Investors Advantage Corp. John, thanks for sticking around.
Sure thing.
Now, I talked about having a license to manage your own investments, which, in all seriousness, hopefully would never happen. But it's funny because in flying, we have all these kinds of acronyms that are designed to have us check ourselves and whether we're feeling good, healthy enough, energetic enough to fly, and things like that. So what can we do other than talk to people one at a time? What can we do to educate the public so that they can check themselves periodically throughout their pre-retirement planning and retirement planning to make sure that this phenomenon you described doesn't happen?
Well, one of the things we can do is check our assumptions, right? To go back to see if what I believe is really, is that going to hold water? Am I going to keep this plane in the air as opposed to just believing that everything's fine? One of the things that we also need to check is an assumption in terms of our longevity expectation. Men in particular, as you know, often believe that I'm going to die before my dad, or maybe just about that. And that's where we set the marker. And yet what you see
By the way,
is,
John?
Yes. Yes.
Do you know why husbands typically die before their wives?
Because they can?
Because they want to, that's why.
Right.
All right, go ahead, John. I'm sorry to interrupt you with that. I apologize.
That's terrible, Dave. That's terrible. So, yeah. And
I've just alienated half my audience, by the way, but oh well.
Because, in many cases, we're seeing a disparity between the haves and the have-nots in terms of longevity. Those who have more seem to live longer. In spite of their habits. Those who have less, well, maybe they're not as interested in off the people they used to piss off. So they just exit stage left. But I'm going to suggest that that we, expect to set our, at least our planning stage at 90 or 100 to see now, will the money run out before I run out? Let's run the numbers to see with these withdrawals, and particularly if they have to increase, to satisfy required minimum distributions or inflation or whatever it might be, if I'm going to live to 100, can I see that this account's going to last, particularly if there's another significant decline in that market? Or as they say, really evaluate some of the tools that are out there are really magnificent for investors to see what kind of loss can you accept? Not just percentages, because nobody gets that, but dollar losses,
like
20%.
I guess to answer my question, then we just have to become evangelists. People like yourself, like me, have to become evangelists. Since everything's self-monitoring, we need to get the word out to let people know that they need to make these checks on a regular basis. And unfortunately, John, time flies when you're having fun, so we need to leave it right there. But thanks so much for being on the show.
My pleasure, Dave. See you next time.
You stay with us, too. We'll be right back with more on the income generation. So up to this point, you've done your top-down analysis, you've examined your goals, you've added up your Social Security and other income sources, and you have a rough idea of how much money you'll need your assets to generate each year to achieve your goals. You also understand that it's not enough just to identify a single lump sum amount that will allow you to meet your income needs. It's just as important, I believe, to have a strategy that avoids the risk of spending down principal and decreases the danger that you'll run out of money. So how then do you find that strategy? The answer, as you've heard me say many times on the show, starts with shifting your focus. Too many people, I believe, are led to think that the best way to increase your retirement income is to focus on portfolio growth and maximizing total return. It's based on the misconception that return and growth are synonymous, when in fact total return is really a product of two things, growth plus income. As I've explained before, the income portion comes in the form of interest and dividends, while growth is measured in capital appreciation. But based upon this misconception, a lot of people believe that in order to increase returns, you must increase growth. and that the best way to do that is through traditional buy and hold investing in the stock market or in mutual funds. In other words, these people have the idea that in order to increase your retirement income, you must increase your risk. The problem with that, of course, is that if your growth turns into shrinkage as a result of a stock market plunge, then your return also shrinks, and so does your income. Investors have experienced this, of course, twice so far since the year 2000. And when that happens, it increases the odds that with a growth-based strategy, you'll be forced to spend down more of your principal to meet your income needs, which of course then increases your odds of running out of money. On the other hand, when your focus on investment strategies like income, the I, not the G, the income instead of growth, you're typically investing in things designed to satisfy your income needs from interest and dividends, which means that you don't have to take it from principal. Moreover, these strategies are also designed to dramatically reduce the volatility and the risk of shrinkage. When focusing on income, you're usually investing in vehicles that can be insured or that come with guarantees from the issuer that let you know your money's secure as it generates income. In other words, although increasing your portfolio growth might require increasing your risks, in my experience, the better approach to increasing your retirement income lies in reducing your risk and focusing on the I instead of the G. And what's more, you can continue to grow your portfolio organically by focusing on income. How? By reinvesting that income that you don't need into other secure strategies. The result, in my experience, is reasonable portfolio growth with a lot less risk and interest and dividend generated income that you can rely on throughout retirement in the range, even in today's low interest rate environment, of 4% or more. And at that rate, you only need a lump sum of about $1 million to satisfy that $40,000 income need per year, as compared to the $1.5 million you'd need at a 2.8% withdrawal rate. As we've seen, focusing on income also decreases the odds you'd end up having to spend down principal or to suffer a real and significant loss with the next major stock market correction. Now it's time to welcome our next guest, Tommy Brown. Pastor Brown is a writer, speaker, and financial development strategist who has written a really interesting book entitled The 7 Money Types. It's a test that we'll put on our website with 35 questions similar to a personality test. Only this test compares your type against the 12 apostles. So at the end of the survey, you'll be able to determine, as Pastor Brown says, discover how God wired you to handle your money. So Pastor Brown, welcome to the show.
Hey, David, thanks for having me on today.
Before I start asking you questions, I need to say to our audience, for the Jewish folks here that are watching, don't go get all offended because most of this comes from the Old Testament. It still applies. And you know what? For the Muslim folks that are watching our show, it may not directly apply, but I guarantee you'll get some gems out of it. So stay with us here. Pastor Brown, tell us why you wrote the book.
So I've helped a lot of people over the years in very practical ways with budgeting and saving, getting out of debt and all of that. But I started to recognize that even when you're out of debt, even whenever you're saving, investing, and all of that, you can still have a lot of anxiety. All of the affective or the emotional aspects of money don't go away whenever you have a really fat bank account. So I wanted to help people understand why they do what they do with money, so that they can do more of what they love. They can resolve tension both in themselves and others, and just clear up a lot of the shame, anxiety, guilt that we have around finances.
Of course, you use the word affective, so of course, all the teachers watching are thinking, ooh, he knows Bloom's taxonomy. He said affective. So give us a brief overview of those different types, and just a few seconds on each one, and then maybe we could drill down on a couple of them, maybe the ones I think that apply to me, perhaps.
Okay. All right. So there are 7 types, and each one is based on a figure from the Old Testament. And the reason we base it on that is because we see in the life of this particular biblical figure that they relate to resources, not like money necessarily, but resources in general from this posture or motivation. So the first one is the Abraham type, and that type loves to use money to demonstrate hospitality. The second is Isaac, and that's your maximizer. That's all about discipline, makes the most of every dollar. The third type is modeled by Jacob. The Jacob type is all about beauty, creating pleasurable experiences and moments. The fourth type is the Joseph type. That's your networker, the connector. The fifth type is Moses, which is all about endurance or order. This type has like budgets for their budgets. And then the Aaron type is about sacrifice or humility, loves to use money to meet needs, social justice minded. And then that last type is going to be the David type, and that's about leadership, creating new futures. They're very entrepreneurial. They're also very much about the next generation.
The David type. Oh, I like that one. So let's talk about the Jacob type, the pleaser. You know, how can somebody tell when that's them?
So the Jacob type, they go over the top on everything. So if they're throwing their child's birthday party, it's not enough just to have color coordinated cups and plates. They're going to probably bring in Cirque du Soleil and like a full-on acrobatic show in the backyard. That person who can't just have the purse, but has to have the nice purse. They have a flair to go over the top and extravagant. And that's not always bad. There's a shadow side to each of these, and the shadow side of the Jacob type is self-indulgence, but at its very best, who doesn't want the person who's the life of the party, who loves to use money to create pleasurable experiences and moments? But that type is different than the other 6 types. So it's important to say none of the 7 types are bad. The point is to claim your type, use it in a way that's healthy for you while realizing that other people are different, and that's where the tension comes in.
Which types would you say in your experience have the greatest chance of financial success, of flourishing financially?
You know, the people who are, if we're gauging success by typical American Western standards, and that's, you know, being very, you might be affluent or those types of things. I would say the types that are going to think about money more in that area are going to be your Isaac type, your Moses type, and probably your David type as well. Your Isaac type is very much on point, very disciplined. Your Moses type is very ordered. Your David type is always creating new futures with money. So entrepreneurial in that end.
That's great. You know, when we get back in just a moment, we're going to talk about some of the other types. And if you find that you fall into some of the other 4 characteristics, then what you can do to kind of keep yourself in check and make sure that it doesn't really sabotage your own retirement. So stay with us. And you stay with us also, our Income Generation viewers. We have a lot more from Pastor Brown when we come back. We'll be right back here on the Income Generation. If you're near or in retirement, head over to theincomegeneration.com and download your special report written specifically for the needs of the income generation, again, those born before 1966. I'm David Scranton, and you've been watching The Income Generation. So obviously, answering the question, how much do I need to retire, is a bit more involved than just figuring out the cost of a trip to the ballpark. But it also isn't rocket science. And you really can get a good idea of following some of the guidelines that we've shared, starting with your top-down financial analysis. But once you've determined a dollar amount and recognize the importance of focusing more on income than growth, that's where a qualified financial advisor can be absolutely valuable. He or she can be crucial in helping you get the allocation right. And as I discussed on a recent show, a good advisor is like a chess grandmaster. While a good chess player typically sees a couple of moves ahead on a chessboard, a grandmaster can see 7 moves ahead. In a similar fashion, while the average person typically sees no more than 5 or 10 years ahead when planning for the future, a good financial advisor can see 30 years ahead or more. That means that he or she is able to prepare you for more possibilities and more contingencies. A perfect example of this, as we discussed recently on a show, has to do with healthcare costs. Although we calculated healthcare costs into general living expenses for our top-down analysis, the reality is that their impact can be much more substantial. Why? Because healthcare and medical costs increase at a much greater rate than the rate of general inflation. Since 1948, the price of medical care has grown at an average annualized rate of 5.3%, compared to 3.5% for the CPI index. In other words, healthcare and medical costs are essentially doubling every 12 years or so. That means by the time a couple in their 60s today reaches their 90s, the need for full-time in-home health care may have risen from the current $200,000 a year or so, all the way up to close to $800,000 a year for full-time home health care. That's a contingency they may not anticipate on their own, but one that a qualified advisor can help them be better prepared to meet with the right allocation. It's also one that clearly illustrates why preserving principal for your later years is so crucially important. So the bottom line is this. Yes, you can probably answer the question, how much do I need for retirement, on your own if you follow the steps we've outlined on the show. But when it comes to determining how best to meet your needs without running out of money, most people can then benefit greatly with the help of a financial professional. Now let's welcome back Pastor Tommy Brown, writer, speaker, financial development strategist, who's written a really interesting book entitled The 7 Money Types. Pastor Brown, thanks for sticking around.
Hey, I appreciate it, Dave. We're having a good time.
Absolutely. So I took some notes here as you were talking, and you talked a lot about the Jacob, for example. It seems to me that Jacob and Abraham are similar in some ways. Am I missing something, or would that be a good analysis?
You're exactly right. So the Abraham type loves to use resources to make other people feel special or noticed. They're very free-flowing, very others-centered. Your Jacob type can be that way as well. They're always thinking about how to bring things to life. They're always scanning the crowd, a little bit of a performer in there, maybe even some artistic tendencies. Your Aaron type down the line as well is also very others-centered, but there's a difference there. So your Abraham type is about hospitality. Your Jacob type is about beauty. Your Aaron type is about meeting needs, about sacrifice. So really what we're doing is pulling back the layers and saying, what motivates me? So any type can be generous, but what am I trying to accomplish? What gives me life? What gives me energy? And so again, as you said at the onset of this, if you don't ascribe to any particular religious system or belief, that's fine. You're still going to recognize these types, these motivations in yourself or perhaps in your partner.
So in those cases, some of the things we mentioned, Abraham, Jacob, what do you do if you read your book, you take the test and you say, uh-oh, that's me. It's not one of the 3 that Pastor Brown said on television gave me the highest chance of the Western world type definition of financial success. Then what can I do about it?
Yeah, so we're wanting not just to go after the typical definition of success. What I'm most concerned about is a holistic sense of financial well-being, so that I'm using money in a way that aligns with my deepest sense of values and joy. And a lot of people look at the Isaac types, the Moses types, your David types, and they're like, that's the best one, and then the rest of them feel a lot of shame about it, and a lot of times they get stuck. So once you find your type, whichever type that you are, the first thing to say is, okay, this is good. How can I gain self-understanding? How can I become aware of some of my tendencies? So for example, let's go to the Abraham type who loves to use money for hospitality. That type is going to spend money on hosting and giving gifts more than any other type in their budget. So they're going to have to be aware of that so they don't blow the budget. The shadow side of the Abraham type is self-reliance or self-sufficiency. They give and give and give, but they have a hard time receiving. So this is really about formation, growth, and development so that I can lean into what gives me joy, and I can make sure that I'm growing in the shadow side area, not trying to grow the shadow side, but growing in that area.
But half of it is just really knowing yourself. Right. As Socrates says, know thyself, and knowing things that could hurt you and making sure that if you're a giver, you don't give so much that you have nothing left, keeping it in check. Good point. We'll be right back. You can stay with us for one more segment, correct?
Yes, sir.
All right, I love it. And you stay with us too. We'll have a lot more from Pastor Brown here on The Income Generation. So we're back again with Pastor Tommy Brown. So we've talked about several of the types. One thing we haven't talked about yet is the networker, Joseph. What do you mean by networker?
So I'm taking you into the lives of these 7 biblical characters. Again, whatever faith tradition you come from, this is like macro level wisdom here, right? We can learn a lot from the Joseph type, which is about networking. It's about connections. And we see in Joseph's life that he was done wrong in a lot of ways, and he built his way back up. And that was all about the nature of his relationships. And ultimately, his faith played into that as well. But the Joseph type is kind of the mayor of whatever this person does. So they're going to be on lots of boards, councils, probably doing lots of lunches and dinners, and they're involved in everything. If you're ever out of work, you want to know a Joseph type because they can open doors of opportunity. So they're very much viewing the holistic network and web of things. And you probably can think of a few people where you're like, yeah, this person loves to use money in order to open doors, opportunities, network, forge those connections and relationships.
Sure. It's all about relationships.
The shadow side is manipulation, though. They can manipulate a little bit as well.
So tell me, the ones that have the highest probability, mathematically speaking, of having that Western definition of financial success. You know, the ones, the Isaacs, the Moses, the Davids. Do you share concerns in the book about perhaps they're focusing so much on that they don't enjoy life enough, they don't have fulfilling of enough life, and if so, then what do they need to do to become more balanced in that way?
You really nailed it, David. And so the Isaac type, that virtue that they bring or that strength that they bring is discipline, maximization. But the shadow side is fear. And because they can be fearful about the financial future, they tend to be a little bit miserly, greedy, utilitarian. And so I want that Isaac type to lighten up a little bit. Enjoy life. Go ahead and buy the $10 frozen yogurt that you know is a waste of your money, and live life to the full while you're at it. Your David types as well, they live so much in the future that sometimes they forget just to enjoy who they are, what they are, and they so identify their personal identity with their work that whenever their work isn't going well or they don't have something new on the horizon, then they just are like, what am I doing? What's going on? And so I walk each of the types through some growth exercises in the book, how to improve upon that shadow side, how to relate to other people who have different types as well. So we're all about formation, about growth, so that when we understand why we do what we do with money, we can change how we handle money.
That's great. I think it's poetic then that my mom and dad chose the name David for me, because my ears are getting hot when you're describing David. So where can our audience find your book?
You can pick it up on any of the online outlets and in your local bookstore as well. It's available on Kindle, in paperback, and also on Audible. And they can also take the quiz. You mentioned it'll be available, a link on your website, or it's on my website as well, TommyBrown.com.
And our quiz will be on the incomegeneration.com website. That's the incomegeneration.com. Pastor Brown, thank you so much.
David, it's been a pleasure. We've had a good time. Thank you.
We'll be back after this important message on the income generation. I don't know about you, but I had a fun time on this show today, and I'm hoping you did too, and I'm hoping that you learned a lot. First of all, John Grace came on and said that 26% was the score on that test for baby boomers. Now, I know our viewers, income generation members, are a lot smarter than the average lot, so you probably would have scored better. But still, you have to admit that's a pretty scary statistic. Tommy Brown, I love his book. I'm going to read his book. I wish I had a chance to read it before the show today. I encourage you to get his book also and to read it, and then come to our website and to take that test. And again, that website's going to be right here on the incomegeneration.com. You know, I opened today talking about sailing off in the sunset as a metaphor for retirement, right? And it's fitting on 2 levels. First, we all want to look forward to retirement as something enjoyable and peaceful, just like sailing. Second, the reality is retirement, yes, is expensive, just like sailing. And just as you wouldn't decide to take up sailing without pricing boats and adding up all the expenses first, you shouldn't go into retirement without first trying to answer that basic question, how much do I need to retire? So working with an advisor at this point, I believe, is oftentimes in your best interest for the very reasons that we talked about today, including the reasons that John Grace mentioned, especially decreasing your risk of running out of money by spending down principal. A professional can also draw on his expertise and the expertise of others to take other factors and contingencies into account, things most people wouldn't think about. If he or she is the right advisor, he or she will work with you to develop the best strategy for you specifically based upon your goals. And if he or she is the right advisor, that person certainly won't try putting you into some one-size-fits-all plan based upon a bunch of outdated financial rules and misconceptions like what we talked about earlier, that growth equals return, or that increasing income requires increased risk. In fact, as we've seen on today's show, neither of those supposed rules is accurate. The bottom line is yes, it's a good idea to take time to try to answer the question, how much do I need to retire? Just keep in mind, though, there's a right way to get the best answer, and that getting it is only the first small step toward creating a successful retirement strategy. Now it's time once again to thank all my guests for joining us today for another episode of The Income Generation, and I'd like to thank you, our new and returning viewers. And we look forward to seeing you again next week here on The Income Generation. If you're near or in retirement, head over to theincomegeneration.com and download your special report written specifically for the needs of the income generation. Again, those born before 1966. I'm David Scranton, and you've been watching The Income Generation.